Welcome to the Truth and Liberty broadcast. We believe we have a mandate to bring godly change to our nation and the world through the 7 spheres or mountains of influence. To further this cause, we give away a product every week that will empower you to get involved in changing your life and changing our world. You can register for our weekly giveaway by subscribing at truthandliberty.net. You can also subscribe to our newsletter to receive weekly updates on guests, news, and much more. This is an interactive live cast, and we welcome your questions. To ask a question during the live cast, use the comment or chat features. Now get ready to dive into this week's topics with our hosts on location in Colorado, USA.
Hello, and welcome to a very special edition of Truth and Liberty. And we are having a unscheduled interview with our county sheriff here, Jason Mikesell, and he's been a blessing to us. He's a believer, loves the Lord, and we've got some special things happening in Colorado. And so I've got one of my vice presidents that is, I forget the exact title, but he's an honor. Do you know what the title?
Honorary Deputy Sheriff's Association.
All right, and so that's Mike Pickett. And yesterday he came to me and shared that he had just had a meeting with the sheriff. And there's some things happening, you know, this legislation that they're pushing because of the George Floyd death and the riots and the things that are happening. I mean, across the country, it's not just right here in Colorado, but across the country, they are beginning to start passing legislation. And I mean, it could really affect things. And of course, the extreme would be like in Minneapolis, they're talking about actually defunding the police and getting rid of the police. I can't even imagine what the logic of that is. And I don't want to put any words in Jason's mouth. I'm going to give him plenty of time to talk here, but my opinion is, from what I've seen, that what was done with George Floyd was just totally wrong. And I've heard other people say that, you know, policemen, they hate bad policing too, just as much as the public does. And so we aren't trying to justify anything that has happened, but to just turn against the law enforcement and lump them all together is not only wrong, it's dangerous. And now the police are, we were just talking right before the broadcast that I think it's Seattle that they've actually taken over 6 city blocks, and they're afraid to do anything, and they're letting them run wild. And I tell you, this cannot be the way that we respond to things. So I am very excited to have our sheriff on, and I believe that he's going to be a blessing to you because you'll get to hear it from a policeman's perspective, which I think lots of times we don't hear that. Right before we get into that, we are going to open this up at the end for questions, and you can ask Jason questions directly. And so I'm going to turn it over to Richard Harris. He's our chief counsel here at Truth and Liberty, and he'll tell you about how you can get involved and send in questions.
All right. Well, thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everybody, for watching. We will be taking questions today, so be sure to post those and your comments. You won't be able to do it for this special live cast on the Truth and Liberty website, but you can on social media. So if you're watching this live cast by Facebook or YouTube or any of our other social media channels, or on the AWMI website, so awmi.net, you can post your questions in the comment section or the chat section on those locations. So we look forward to getting your questions in. And then also I wanted to mention that Truth and Liberty is supported by our viewers, and we are so thankful for your generosity. We are a 501c4 organization, which means that we are tax exempt, but your donations are not tax deductible. So we need to let you know that. But your donations do support the work of the Lord just as much as any other nonprofit. So you can give to Truth and Liberty on our website. Just go to truthandliberty.net/donate. I wanted to mention also our membership program. If you're not a member of Truth and Liberty, you can be one just by going to that site, truthandliberty.net/donate, and go to the Become a Member spot and click that and make a donation, a commitment of at least $5 per month, a recurring donation, and you'll become one of our members, and we'll send you in the mail a free gift, which is a copy of the New England Primer, which is the most widely used textbook for school children during America's founding era. A great little book and resource to have. So with that, I'll kick it back to you, Andrew.
And also let me mention that Richard mentioned the Truth and Liberty website, we encourage you to watch on there because we do get censored on a regular basis on Facebook and some of these things. Anytime we say something that doesn't fit their narrative, they all of a sudden have technical problems and lose us. So go to truthandliberty.net, and that way you'll be able to get in on it. So Jason, it's a real honor to have you on here, and we just want to turn you loose. First of all, we need to find out what is happening here in Colorado. What is this legislation that they're trying to ram through?
Well, I want to say thank you so much for having me come on tonight and asking me to be here. I very much appreciate that. And there's a lot of challenges that we're now facing in Colorado, and I think a lot of fears over how law enforcement is doing their business on a day-to-day. And I think there was recently a Senate bill that came up, House Bill 2217, which in the beginning was really what I believe was a knee-jerk reaction to what happened in Minnesota. And although I watched what happened in Minnesota, and I believe it was very much wrong, the gentlemen that were involved with that have been brought to justice there. They are expected to go before a judge and deal with the crimes that they committed, and I'm very happy about that. And in law enforcement, we see that as we police our own. We want to make sure that those types of bad actors aren't dealing with the citizens.
I've not heard anybody that actually defends what happened. I mean, it was just wrong.
I don't know how you could defend it.
But you know, there are preachers that are wrong. But do we want to shut down all churches because some preachers run off with the church secretary or steal money or on and go? I mean, that's just ludicrous.
Well, you have roughly 700,000 law enforcement officers in the state, in the United States. And what I saw was this knee-jerk reaction was putting all of them on trial. All those men and women in blue that have been the saviors of so many people when they're in their times of need also, and they're facing challenges of domestic violence and crimes against them. These men and women stand up for those victims. And what we're seeing now is that all that goodness that's been done has been just erased by one incident, one person that makes a bad choice, and it will ultimately pay the price for that. But what's happening is that we in law enforcement are ultimately paying the price for what was done. And that's what so makes me sad to see a House bill like this come through so quickly. You know, this House bill was a 7-day affair when it began. It got dropped very quickly, went through the Senate. We really, when it started, felt like it was a prosecution of law enforcement. It was meant to hurt somebody in law enforcement. And really what's happened since then is there's been some calmer heads that have prevailed, and it's started to get better, but it still brings up a lot of legal challenges. I think for First Amendment rights of police officers. The second part of that is there's really not an appeal process for these types of things, and I think it's a very scary bill.
So what is the bottom line? Does this make the police officers liable? Does it take away their immunity from being sued, or what's happening?
It does to a degree, and that's the scary part. Really, it turns over a lot of this to the state or an employer to identify whether that officer acted correctly. Well, here's the problem with most Colorado counties right now. Most of their budgets for someone to fight a lawsuit deals with county commissioners. They have the funds for that. The sheriff doesn't have his own attorneys for most agencies. What happens is when you're sued, you go in and then they'll look at those cases and they'll go, well, it'll cost less if we just go ahead and settle this case. Well, the problem is that officer may be on the hook for up to 5% or 25%, depending on whether the county will indemnify them or cities. But they're the ones in control of that indemnification. So it allows groups like the ACLU to launch more lawsuits and put more pressure on regular law enforcement officers. And it's not just the issue of being sued, it's all the heartache and the stress that goes along with that. I mean, it's not a fun thing to be sued, especially by groups such as this. And I have a lot of experience with being sued.
You have been sued by the ACLU.
Yeah, and it's not.
Tell a little bit about that, because I am really thrilled that you stood up against this, I guess, sanctuary city mentality, and you've gone to court a number of times and won.
Yep, we've gone to court several times and won. I'm fortunate I have a great county attorney. I have commissioners that have backed me, because without their backing, you can't go forward. But what it really stemmed over was the fact of having my deputies use federal authority and go through a federal training program so that they could then make arrests inside of my jail that are holding people that the United States government has said, these people are bad. We don't want them out into the general population. And we want to hold them for either prosecution or deportation out of the United States. The reason all this came up was we had an issue with cartels in our county. We had an issue with a lot of organized crime in the beginning that really stemmed from our marijuana laws. Yeah. When that occurred, we started to arrest a lot of folks that were here illegally. And then the U.S. government would ask for us to hold them. And it all comes up over the fact that the ACLU and different groups don't want us to hold those people. But to protect our community so I don't release the same types of people back out over and over and over again, we said, no, we are going to hold them to protect our community. And these aren't just somebody that had a traffic ticket. These are somebody that had assaults. They had arrests for violent crimes. They had multiple drug crimes. They'd been coming back into the United States multiple times. And really, I saw a president that really wanted to make a change and protect states and groups and our populace. And this became a big battle.
Now, there were people actually that were working for the cartels. I mean, the cartels were at work in Teller County. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Now, that's amazing to me that this would be happening right where I am. And I love the fact that you got in. How long did it take you to clear them out?
About 6 months. Yeah, it took us about 6 months. And it was through great police work by the deputies. They have a buy-in to their community. They want to do something. It took a lot of work with our district attorney's office, getting everybody together and really pushing the issue to stop those problems in the county.
And am I understanding you correctly that like ICE, when they want to take a person and deport them or something, the problem was that the local police couldn't detain them. They had to turn them over to the enforcement agencies. But you trained your deputies so that they were working for the federal thing and they could. So that was really smart. I'm assuming this was done on purpose. It didn't just happen.
It was. And what it stopped was the different groups from being able to sue us constantly. And it allowed them then to use federal authority where their state authority stopped to make the arrest. Because in the state of Colorado, as a Colorado law enforcement officer, I can't make an arrest under federal holding orders or what we call there's a form name that you have to use, but we couldn't arrest under that. Or hold unless you're a federal agent. So that's why now we have trained up federal agents.
So let me ask you, if a person was to, say for instance, get stopped and they're a minority, and if they said, well, this was racial harassment, there was no reason to stop me, could they file a lawsuit? And I guess if you get the ACLU or something involved, they could file $1 million lawsuit. And if the people just say that, man, we don't want to fight this, we don't want to pay the attorney fees, and if they settle out of court, does this make the officers liable for a portion of that?
That's the fear. If a county will not give them that immunity needed, or they say, you know what, we don't think that what you did was within the rights. And what it says is your employer. Well, here's the thing. A sheriff employs those deputies, but the deputies really work for the county also. So depending on who your county commissioners are, or unless they want to have to fight a lawsuit like this, they can release that and they can say, nope, we don't believe you acted within good faith. And so there's a lot of issues here, and we won't really know until one actually happens, but then it's too late because a young officer may have issues.
So like take the county of Denver, for example. Obviously the Denver City Council is, politically speaking, pretty liberal. And so this law would put the decision, the officers, really whether he's going to be liable for those damages, is going to put it in the hands of those liberal city council members who are under all kinds of political pressure from whatever the forces are at work in that city and so on. It's not a court of law that decides that. It's the politicians.
Well, yeah, and you're seeing that all across the United States right now. You're seeing city councils that don't support their police departments that are using their authority to stop the police from doing what they need to be doing.
So how is it now? How is this legislation? What would change? What would the difference be?
One of the differences is that we are mandated by state law to have body cameras now. Well, that all sounds well and good, but here's the problem. It's an unfunded mandate that says, hey, you will purchase these things, and they're not cheap. You know, the normal body camera goes from anywhere between $500 and $1,200. Well, they're like any other piece of technology. They break, they have issues, you have to replace them. And what we're seeing is that, well, we're going to have that cost for every officer that interacts with the public at any time, even for me. And then once you use that, then it has to go into a storage medium. Well, here's the other problem. The storage, as you probably know, is very expensive to store video footage.
Yep.
And then we have to do redactions, and we have to have people that are there that are making sure that juveniles and victims of crimes aren't being seen, and things they say are being blotted out. And what that really starts to do is run your cost up. So for an agency of my size, which we're about 100 staff, you know, we're looking at about $400,000 bill to start out with. Well, those are taxpayer
that's your total
funds.
staff. That's not just
That's just total.
law enforcement officers on the ground, right?
No, that's everyone within the agency. So really, you know, 78, somewhere in there are going to have to wear those.
So how many people would you have to add to staff this?
You know, really for the redaction and the other pieces, probably two new records folks for making sure that one of the new reporting processes is all the information that has to be reported to the state on an annual process. I'll probably need another 2 that just do that just are collating the information and making sure that it's correct all the time.
So you just have a certain amount of money, and if you have to start spending money on all of these clerical positions and other equipment and stuff, that means you're going to have less law enforcement on the streets.
And that's it. When you have a finite amount of money that taxpayers give you, the answer is not always to raise taxes to make the taxpayers have to pay. And when the state says, hey, you will or you shall, and then if you don't use your body cameras, we're going to give you a $10,000 fine, you know, all those things start to coalesce into how are we going to do this? You know, how are we going to fund this? Do I need to start laying off people? And it seems to be that's what they're talking about. That seems to not be a big deal to them. But these are young men and women that are in a career and they have children and they're trying to make ends meet. And now all of a sudden I'm supposed to add to the population that's not employed. So it's scary for me.
Well, it's not only scary for you, it's scary for me, because if we don't have the police around, you know, I was thinking the other day that they ought to put some sign on all of these city council people that don't want police, and they ought to just put a sign up, no police here, and see how that goes. They'd have all of the rapists and the murderers and the thieves and stuff go to those places. Yeah. That's just crazy.
Well, you know from being a pastor, you know, they always want you in their time of need. Mm-hmm. But then there's times when somebody doesn't want you. And what we're seeing across the nation right now is that you have a smaller amount of people that are making a very large deal about the rest of the United States and their officers. And really, those people that aren't saying anything, that are supporters of law enforcement, you know, those are ones that have to get involved now.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. How do you get involved? How do you make a difference?
You know, contact your local police departments or sheriff's department. Let them know that you care and that you are behind them. You know, we say protect the blue, because now is that time when law enforcement officers across the nation have stood over other people to protect them. I think now is some time when we have to ask for help to protect us and to stand up and contact your legislatures and let them know we're not going to stand for these things. We want rules and law and order, and we want that in our lives. So that it scares me to have a country that may become lawless without law enforcement for my children.
Well, it would never last. I mean, it'd be anarchy, and in a very short period of time, they'd try and add them back. But once you start laying these people off, they're going to have to make a living, and they may not be agreeable to come back. Also, my wife and I talked about how in the world do the police feel when I read about one that it had urine thrown on him, bottles thrown at him. They're saying terrible things. Y'all are people. How in the world? It would make me want to say, all right, you don't want my help? Goodbye.
You know, and I tell people all the time, you know, that officer's name is John or Joe.
Yeah.
He has a family. He bleeds as red as anyone else. And at the end of the day, you know, you're calling another fellow human being that you're saying is a person that's not respecting you, and they're not being respected in return. And I will tell you, the amount of training a law enforcement officer gets in this state is pretty impressive. Normally you have an employee and they work 2,080 hours a year. We all know that that's the magic number for a full-time employee. And now you have officers in my agency that are 280 hours of training a year. That's a lot of training.
Yeah, that is.
And when you start talking about, they need better training, how are you going to fit that in? I already lose 70 some officers every year, 285 or 260 some hours a year. And on top of that, vacation time, sick time, all those things, because they're human, they need to do these things. So you don't have them on the streets anyways. And now those same people that are being trained on anti-bias training, how to use force correctly, what not to do constantly, what not to say. And now all of a sudden they're standing in front of a group of people that are screaming that they're not trained well enough and they're just robots. And no, they're people. They're good people.
That's terrible.
It is terrible.
You know, we were talking before we went on the air that I think some of this stuff is just reactionary, and they're trying to look good in the sight of these people because there's so much anger and stuff right now. And you mentioned the chokehold, that they're saying you got to stop the chokehold, and you were saying that hasn't been used in years. Is that just local, or is this nationwide?
You know, I don't know if it's nationwide. I know locally we haven't used a chokehold in years. The only time a chokehold was ever used when there's what we call a lethal force option, where there's no other way you could have stopped this. Maybe they had your gun, there was something going on. But really, even in those circumstances, very rare, and we just don't use them. I found it interesting when I saw that, there's chokeholds, and I'm going, boy, I just haven't seen it in many, many years.
Mm-hmm.
So
what that officer did in the George Floyd, that was not a approved procedure for restraining a suspect?
Not for our agency. Now, each agency is different on how they handle use of force. Every state's a little bit different on what they use. But, in this state, that's not an authorized use. Just the amount of time, the things people were saying, while he was doing that, it should have been what we call a clue. And unfortunately, no one picked up on that.
And I read that he had been written up 18 times in 18 years of service for using excessive force. How does a person like that is not following the guidelines stay on the force? How does this happen?
I don't know. From my personal experience, we treat every interaction where somebody is complained on, very serious. We do investigations. All law enforcement does that, not just now. I don't know internally what they've done, and you can't second guess what that agency's done. I just don't know enough about it to say. But I do know one thing, that doesn't happen in most agencies. And I don't know if that really happened there. I just don't know any of the information as to how that occurred.
I tell you, it's just wrong to paint a broad stroke that all police are bad because you see somebody do something like this. Mm-hmm. I don't know the percentages, you might, but I bet you that the number of police that do something wrong is very small compared to, you said there's 700,000 plus policemen.
Yeah, right around there, yeah.
It's a very small percentage.
Well, you got to think, a law enforcement officer goes through a lot more investigations too for something. If you're just an average person and an officer, you get in a struggle with somebody, you have an officer and a district attorney that probably looks at that case. When you have one with us, you have a investigation that occurs, a criminal investigation, and at the same time you have an internal investigation that runs. So you're being investigated by two separate groups. Once that one's collated, you may have a district attorney that looks at that case too and sees what is happening with it and if it was right or wrong. And then you may be termed as that you did something wrong by all of them, one of them. You may have done something wrong in the internal investigation. So there's a lot more investigations for a law enforcement officer than even a standard person on the street.
This is a personal question, and you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, but I saw a thing where a guy was shot 4 times in the back. He was running away from the police. And why do they shoot a person? Like some of them get shot 4, 6 times. How does this happen? Seems like you could shoot them once and at least catch them. How come that happens?
It's hard to say because you aren't there, and it's hard to second or quarterback something that you weren't involved in. But here's the thing: in real life, things happen very quickly. The speed of that interaction and how that occurs, it's seconds. So an officer has to, or a deputy has to make a split-second decision on what to do, and once that decision happens, it's hard to change that. So what we have is what we train on is called an OODA loop, right? You observe something happening, you orientate to it, or your body automatically starts to turn to it. You decide on your action and you act, and your mind goes through that process on every single event. Well, that mind that's where you're at, and it's hard to change that action as you move through. So it could be that person turned very quickly. It could have been the officer was already firing because he saw something. You just don't know. There's so much involved.
You know, Sheriff, I was looking at this law that we're talking about here today, and it's got about 10 different things that an officer is supposed to consider before he uses force. And I'm wondering to myself, in those heat of the moment situations, how in the world are you going to assess all those things at the same time? And if you mess up, boom, that's it. Your certification's revoked. You can be liable for damages, and all kinds of penalties kick in.
Yeah.
What does that look like to you from your experience?
Well, I'm glad you asked, because here's the thing. If I give someone a test right now and I have 10 check boxes, and I tell them you've got to make a check at every single one of those boxes before you decide to act, how long is it going to take you? So that officer is taking all 10 check boxes and doing it like that. Mm-hmm. And the problem is, in that split second, someone else may have been firing on you or attempting to take your life. Mm-hmm. So we shortcut a lot of that by really heavy training as to how to make those decisions quickly. We do training on scenario-based. You know, what could occur? How could it occur? So you're always playing chess in your mind as to what's going to occur next. How am I going to deal with it? Where am I going to move to? So you have officers, and they're really warriors of peace. You know, they don't want to have these issues happen, but they have to make that split-second decision.
Well, there's a lot of people, though, that say that's not true. Police are just bad and stuff. And again, that is taking a few people and just attributing that to everybody. I believe what you're saying, that the vast majority are there to serve. They certainly aren't there for the money. You don't get rich being a cop. And what's it worth to be shot at? Put your life on the line. That's amazing. I could just imagine a cop pulling out his list of 10 things. Let me see. Have I done this and this and this? As somebody shooting at you. It's just a little hard to do it that way.
And you know, the scenario will give you that instant. If somebody's shooting at you, you know they probably mean to do harm to you. You can go to that next step. But until it happens, it's a scary moment. And those officers are like any other human being on this earth. They're in fear also.
Right.
You know, they're excited. All those things are running through them. For 20 years, I've been in the use of force business with the SWAT teams and understanding all those predicaments and comforting deputies after they've had something happen, a traumatic incident where they've had to shoot or they've been in a struggle for their own lives. And you don't understand how much emotion that officer feels in that moment. They're breaking down, they're crying. And the only thing you can do is tell them how much you love them, that it'll be okay. You know, they're going to go home to their wife and family, and that's important. Because I've been on the other end of it too, where I've been a pallbearer for those officers that have died, that were good friends that it happened to. And then you're having to comfort a wife and a family and a newborn baby over, this is what happened to them.
And to that point, you know, they're individuals just like all the rest of us. And when a person approaches you and they're militant and they're antagonistic, it just ratchets it up to another level. Yeah. You know, I've told this to my kids. My kids have had a number of run-ins with the police, and they don't always have a good attitude towards it. But I've been stopped, I bet you, 8 times in 30 years for speeding or something. And every time they'll come up and I say, you know what, I was speeding. I'm guilty. I just wasn't paying attention. Sorry. And they have let me go. I hadn't had a ticket in 30 years. My kids, if they ever get stopped, they'll get a ticket every time. And it's because of that attitude. Policemen are people, and when you approach them with an attitude, in a sense, you're hurting yourself by doing such.
You know what got me the most on this House bill was that it basically paints the picture that every officer is an issue. And I will tell you that throughout my career, I had thousands and thousands of interactions that were positive with people. On a daily basis, you're talking to maybe 20, 30 people, officers across country. So you take 700,000 times 1,000 contacts a year. That's a lot of contacts where there isn't an issue. There's not a problem. They treated them well. They talked to them. If you drive down the road in this county, you're going to have a deputy that waves at you.
Yeah.
You know, that's because they're good people. They want to do good things.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think, how much role does the media have in this whole situation, where it seems like the only stuff we see on TV and social media is the negative cases where someone gets shot or someone gets unfairly treated by an officer. And so do you think the public's getting a false perception as to what really is going on out there?
Well, I think there's a couple things that happen with media. And in some of it's a problem with law enforcement. We have to learn. We have to learn to push the positive messages to the bigger media outlets also. We have to learn to help give the narrative, and not only the narrative being the bad narrative from people that want to complain about law enforcement. But do I think that the media stirs the pot, especially at a national level?
Mm-hmm.
I think we can all see that on a daily basis.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Bad
absolutely.
news sells.
Yeah.
I saw something on one of the news feeds today, and they said that one of the pictures of a policeman, I think, pushing somebody and they fell and hit their head or something like that. They've been showing that, but they found out it was an edited deal. They didn't show that the person had thrown bricks at them and done other things, and that this was basically a defensive move. And so it's a lot of it is how you present it.
Well, and I think that's important on the media side too, because, you know, I think the First Amendment is a beautiful thing. I think you have the right to protest. You have the right to do it peacefully. I don't think you have a right to throw a brick at someone.
I agree.
You know, if you know, it's interesting to me. We talk about, you know, throwing tear gas at rioters, not protesters, but rioters. We talk about firing these rubber bullets, and in return, if you watch a lot of the news clips, they're getting pelted with water bottles. Well, nobody tells you that's a frozen water bottle. You're being pelted with a rock or a brick that's doing damage. You have a New York PD that had over 300 and some people injured that are in law enforcement that were on those riot lines.
That's terrible.
Yeah. Since the George Floyd's death, over 700 police officers injured in the line of duty in these riots, and the media's not talking about that.
Yeah.
Well, I have a question for you, Sheriff, and it's this law, as I read it, will make law enforcement officers personally, individually liable for up to $25,000 out of their own pocket for just about any infraction. And I'm wondering, I know that the salaries for our law enforcement is not the highest, but what is that going to do? Or do you have any concerns about what that is going to do to the ability to recruit and retain good officers?
Oh, I think it's a huge issue for us. You know, look, now you have the ACLU is able to sue constantly on something they term as a constitutional violation. Just the mere stop could be a constitutional violation. There's always, you know, small things that people do. The issue for me to be able to retain, or anyone to be able to retain as they see these things going on, is, can we make it a viable career? I don't know that you can right now. You know, I'm very nervous about losing really good officers that are trying to do a lot of good things for our communities, that are saying, I don't know if I want to continue doing this, because we're always under the gun for all these issues, even though they're good people. So yeah, I think that portion has a lot of fear for officers.
So do you think it's a reality that if this passes, that you could lose some of your deputies because they just don't want to expose themselves to that?
I will tell you, the gentlemen that I have that are older, that really are the cornerstone of a good agency, is having somebody that's got years of experience, able to teach deputies what they need to do, be the mentors for them. The mentors are saying, we've had enough. So you're going to see a lot more retirements, because here's the other side. Yeah, it's $25,000, but I'm not so sure you can't keep doing something towards those officers once for their retirements, or bring up new claims, because those claims are being justified. So then I sue them on another claim personally, because it's already been gone through the courts and said, hey, yeah, they have a civil piece to this.
So if they didn't actually pass legislation to defund the police, the ACLU could basically get rid of a law enforcement agency by just filing lawsuits constantly.
Yeah, and they do that now. I think this just makes it more of an open season.
Well, one of the things that maybe it takes a lawyer to spot this, but I saw in this law is an attorney's fee shifting provision, which is really significant because lawyers are looking to make money. And if they see, when they realize this law has that in there, they're going to be highly motivated to sue law enforcement officers. So a prevailing plaintiff will get his attorney's fees and costs, but the officer will not, even if he wins, unless it's proven to be a frivolous claim, which almost never happens. What's that going to do to the morale out there?
Well, you know, we all as law enforcement officers know we're not going to get anything on a frivolous claim. When have you ever seen a government entity be able to go after frivolous claims, especially in court? It's not going to happen. The other side too is what will tend to happen is that you have groups like the ACLU that their fees, if it's a frivolous, is very small, right? Because they're a 501c3, but yet if they win and they want their attorney fees, they're exorbitant.
Yeah.
So they're allowed to do whatever they want. If we want reform, that would be a great place to start with reform, is on how they can sue people.
Can you help the people to just project, if we were to defund the police, what would our society be like? What are the consequences?
You know, my fears is that you will then see state agencies take over all policing because you wouldn't have localized police. Someone has to do something. And you're starting to see that with some of the reports coming out of Seattle now too, where those groups that are supposedly going to be good neighbors and work together and they're going to respond to those situations, they're now asking business owners for fees for protecting them. So we go back to something we saw.
Mafia.
Yeah, in the 1920s.
Wow.
You know, we're really changing the direction and going backwards, I think, in policing.
Would that give rise to like private security? People have to do that to...
It would. Yeah, that is probably the next step, is the privatized security. But, you know, privatized security is, they don't respond to issues like police. Police are the responders to go and stop something. Security stops at the gates. You know, that's really their job, is to secure something. So two totally different pieces. You know, in Colorado, we've got laws that say Colorado can't have a policing group that does widespread policing, like a sheriff or a police department. That has to change at some point if it continues that way, because the defunding.
What do you mean widespread
Policing.
policing? Yeah, what does that mean?
So what I mean by that is that you then have a state police agency, like you see in
So you're just
Mexico
saying that you're localized.
Yep, we're localized. You know, this is our county and we police the county, and that's really how that works. Or you have a municipality that polices that city.
So if the guy outruns you and crosses the county line, you back off?
Well, the law gives us the right to go after him, yeah. Now, some of that's changing there too. We don't pursue as much as we used to.
Not that I ever need to know this, but
Yeah.
I just wondered.
Well, I wanted to mention that we've got some information we can put up on the screen for folks who live in Colorado or anywhere. If you want to, you can call your legislator and tell them you're opposed to this law and to any laws like it. So I think the website that we're sending folks to is openstates.org, and you can put your address in there and look up who your legislator is, what his phone number or her phone number and email are. And if you're in Colorado, let them know that you're opposed to SB 2217, SB 2217, that you want them to vote against it. And it's already been through the Senate here. It's now in the House of Representatives. So look up your representative in Colorado and let them know that you're opposed to this.
And right before we go to some questions for Jason, let me ask you, what would you tell people, because we got people watching from all across the nation, what is the most effective thing that they can do to support the police?
I think have a voice. You know, we're so used to letting things go and only those few have the voice. I think now's the time for them to come out and talk to people about this. Tell them what they think about it. Protect your policemen, your deputy sheriffs. That's the serious piece to this, is that we need your protection too in law enforcement right now. We need you to talk about it. We need you to have a voice. Because if not, I think it changes the whole face of policing in this country and changes the country at its base.
I know that when we get 70,000 contacts a month, but 5 criticisms will have everybody buzzing. It seems like that it doesn't take much to affect you. How about when you get somebody that comes up and supports you and says something, does it affect you or does it get lost amongst?
Oh, it affects us. And the thing is as a sheriff's department, we receive so much good interaction and feedback from people constantly telling us, you know, you did a great job. Thank you for coming
Man,
out.
I'm good to hear that.
It is. It's amazing.
I didn't know
And those are the nice things.
I think I've been listening to the national news too much. I just figured everybody was all upset at the police.
I've had to shut it off. Even I was questioning it. And really, it's not that way. You have so many good people that love the police, love their law enforcement.
Good.
And those are the people we need to hear, that your senators and your legislatures and your congressmen need to hear those things.
So it does make a difference.
Makes a huge difference.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Got some questions?
Andrew, we've got a lot of questions coming
All right.
in. This is one of the longest lists I've seen. Here's one that comes from Karen Wade on Facebook, and she asks, what about places where officers have to have a minimum amount of arrests and are told to go to places with minorities, immigrants, and lower income neighborhoods? Does that happen?
No, not that I've seen. Those are what's called quotas. Agencies aren't allowed to have quotas. And normally on that type of thing, I've not seen it in our jurisdiction, and I'm not aware of it in anyone else's jurisdiction. We do a lot of training with other sheriffs and police chiefs around the country, and I've just not seen that.
Well, I've heard that argument before. Is this just fabricated? Is this one of the talking points that they have against her? Or is
Urban myth, maybe?
Urban myth, I think, yeah. You know, really, law enforcement in those areas are the reactionary. And they're reacting to something that is occurring, but you don't see quotas like that.
All right, well, here's another one. We hear a lot about Antifa and white supremacists at these protests. How do the police discern between these domestic terrorists and just rowdy citizens? Well,
it's awfully hard sometimes, I think, especially if you're within a group that this is happening in. If you know, we don't have a lot of Antifa members in Teller County. We're not seeing that. Yeah, we're not seeing the rowdy type of citizens, you know, having.
We hadn't had any protest here, have we?
No, I think, you know, we've had 2 people with a sign. They were good about it. They weren't a problem, and you know, I'm glad they got to exercise their First Amendment.
Yeah.
But you know, we're just not seeing the Antifa members up here. Now, I think of those crowds. They have the look. They have the equipment. They're agitating. So you see those types of things. But you know, without being there, I can't tell you. I don't have enough experience in those crowds dealing with it.
So down in Colorado Springs, they've been having larger protests, and they've had some get rowdy. I don't know that they've done looting or anything. Are you aware of that?
You know, I'm not aware of that. I know that we did send some of our personnel down there to assist them with some things, because in the end, we're all together in this. There is no, you know, not having some part of this issue across the country. So even for us, we've been a part of those things.
Here's a question from, it says Karis Bound on chat. Would you be able to comment on the statistics showing a disproportionate number of blacks are killed by police over whites?
You know, I don't have that statistic with me.
Okay.
You know, I just was studying that yesterday because I've got some criticism over it. And one of the ways they do that is that there's 12 to 13% of the U.S. population that's black. And if you take the young blacks, they say it's anywhere between 2 and 6%. And if you take the smallest number, 2% of the black youths, and then you look at how many are arrested or killed, well, then that's where they get this thing that it's disproportional. But also you could take this statistic that like the 2 to 6% of black youth commit over 50% of all of the felonies, and that just puts them in the crosshairs with the police more often. So I think that that's manipulating statistics.
You know what I'd love to see a statistic on is how many Americans were affected. You know, how many Americans from you know, this financial grouping or in these locations where the issues were. And you don't ever see that, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you're black or white or yellow or brown. You're Americans, I thought. That's the way I was raised, and that's the way I looked at it in policing, is that everyone has a voice, and everyone's needs to be loved and cared for, and that's what we look at, not the colors.
Good friend of mine, E.W. Jackson, he's a black man, and he just spoke this last weekend in our conference, and he said if you could just wave your hand and make everybody the same color, they'd find something else about your hairstyle, about the color of your eyes. There would be something. It's just human nature. There's evil in some people, and they are going to find something. And we make it black and white, but it's not. It's just there's some people that are doing things that are wrong. Praise God, we need law enforcement to be able to curb that.
Here's some questions about President Trump and the situation. This viewer, L. Dykes on chat, asks, how long will President Trump wait before he sends in the National Guard? Of course, you don't know that answer, but what are the president's options from a national law enforcement perspective?
Well,
like the situation in Seattle, I think is what they're asking about.
Yeah, in Seattle, I think what's happening is that the president is allowing states to choose their route on how they want to deal with something. You know, there's a lot to calling up the National Guard to send them into these things. The National Guard doesn't even have as much training in doing this as the law enforcement officers. And really, unless you have your local city councils and state representatives that have enough backbone to stand up to say, stop, even the president sending in someone would probably cause even more issues. And at this point, you need good leadership, and I think the president at some point will do something. And usually it's a National Guard element because it's hard to really bring in the military forces because that's a whole different ball game. That's posse comitatus laws. There's a lot of laws in place to stop those things or to only do it for certain reasons, where the National Guard has more of the ability to do that, but they're state forces.
Right.
So what would happen if this thing in Seattle just continues on? Does President Trump actually have the rights to intervene? And what would cause him to be able to solve that?
You know, he has the right to do those things at any time.
Oh, he does.
He does. He can, you know, the president has a lot of powers to help stop those issues from occurring. But really, that's the problem with cities like that is how are they going to back even those forces? Who's going to be there to help them if you have a city council pushing back? That's a big issue.
Like you said, it'd be a lot better to get the trained law enforcement because, you know, the National Guard, like you said, from my understanding, Kent State riots and stuff and the people that were killed, it was National Guard, I think, that they weren't trained and they panicked and shot, and that's how people got killed.
And the National Guard are wonderful. They came and helped us during the COVID response. I love them. They're wonderful. Are they ready for that type of organizations to come against them in cities like that? I don't know. And the scary side of it is, you know, really our military is supposed to be that outside sword that goes forth and make sure that we're protected, and law enforcement is supposed to be the shield within the country that helps protect and bring peace to things. And I don't know how that's going to go with the National Guard.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, here's a good question from Sherry Bradford on Facebook, and she asks, what can we do to be in balance? How can we support the police and hold them accountable? I don't think it should be either or.
Yeah, and really there's a scale, and you look at those scales and we try to come together on these, but I think that we got to quit doing knee-jerk reactions. I think you have groups that are out there wanting to make sure things are right, and you have state legislatures, and I think that if we came together, law enforcement and the community, and we do that here, we have those organizations that are like the HDSA, and we bring in citizens all the time to make sure that we're doing what the citizens need and what they see. And even in Colorado Springs, you're starting to see, you know, they have a citizens group that they're starting, and I think that's a good start. That's the way to do it. In law enforcement, you have to be inclusive of everybody in the community. And I think that's one of the things that you're starting to see is they want more inclusive, but it can't be the extremists on either side.
Absolutely. I agree.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious, Sheriff, about what kind of training officers get to handle accusations of bias or racism, or really what kind of training do you get to not be racist? I don't know if you can change a person's heart, but on that subject, what kind of training do you get?
You know, we do anti-bias training annually and quarterly, and then when a new officer comes on, they immediately get that. The state has mandates on that in the academy, so they get it, a double dose of it, and they get it every year. And those are always something you're looking for. if you start to see those complaints, you're investigating those complaints. It's a constant. We do what's called internal investigations about those allegations. So there's a lot that gets done to that to make sure they're up on their training.
Well, you know, this whole COVID virus thing, looking back, I think that we overreached, overreacted, but I'm not sure that I could have done any better because they were predicting 3 million deaths. And so you panic and you overreact. I think the same thing is happening here with the police. People see something that is egregious and everybody agrees on it, and so they think we've got to do something. And if you aren't careful, you're going to handcuff the police, wind up driving people out of law enforcement, and it'll be way overreaction.
Yeah.
It's just human nature.
And I think you're absolutely right.
Here's an interesting question, Sheriff. This comes from an unknown guest, but the guest asks, Sheriff Mikesell, what would you say to these corrupt cops if they were listening?
You know, that what you did to the rest of us has caused a nationwide epidemic about how we're going to destroy law enforcement. And it's something that should not have been done. It's something that just scares me to my heart as to seeing our officers treated the way they are. They have ruined hundreds of years of law enforcement in this country and a progression to where we're at now.
Yeah. And you know, the same thing happens to preachers. There was a time that preachers, man, if you were a preacher, they respected you. But because of all the preachers that do so many weird things and stuff, we aren't respected. One time I was buying a used car, and the used car salesman said, just trust me. And I said, trust you? You're a used car salesman. And he says, you're a preacher. And I said, touche, you got me. But, you know, we've lost a lot of our reputation because of what other people do. So again, this is just human nature to say that all law enforcement is bad because one or two people is bad. And I'm not saying it's only one or two, but a few are bad. It's just wrong.
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
wrong.
Well, here's another one. This comes from SCJ on chat. There's an argument about defunding the police. I heard that defunding the police is not the same thing as disbanding the police. Can you address this?
You know, there's been a lot of talk about this, and I find it very interesting, the rhetoric on this. Defund the police can mean one of two things. A, we don't want any police. And then it was softened because people went, oh, you're crazy. Now it's become, well, it means that we're going to cut your budgets, cut your training, cut your, in one scenario, they're telling us, oh, you need more training, but we're going to cut your funding so you can't do training. If you cut, then you have less officers. Well, here's the problem that happens when you have less officers. The less amount of people, when there's more force being used, means that least amount of force or less officers has to make decisions that are more harsh probably to get control of a situation. So when you defund and you cut the different positions, you're taking away that, now you're putting an extra load on more people. You have more stressors, you have more things that are occurring. So that's what they're talking about. I truly think in the beginning when they said defund police, it was defund police.
Absolutely.
That's why they've taken over police departments, and they're wanting city councils to say no more police at all. And then what happened was, when they thought it was going to hurt political careers, they said, oh, wait a second, we just mean to cut some funding to them.
I heard a guy spend 20 minutes explaining that, no, what this means is it like 911 calls, it could go to a socialist, a social worker, socialist. It could go to a social worker, then we'll send them instead of the police. And he was trying to explain it. But I heard that councilwoman in Minneapolis, and she was absolutely talking about doing away with the police. Yeah. So I think you nailed it, that they meant exactly what they said. And in hindsight, they're trying to soften the blow.
Yeah.
Here's a question from Hazel Villagante on Facebook. I believe the majority of our churches choose to be silent on this. What can you say to the pastors who believe it was okay to speak against the death of George Floyd, but are quiet regarding the violent reaction that happened because of that, and are also quiet regarding support to our police? Would you like for pastors to speak up?
Yeah, I would. And here's the thing. It's, law enforcement pastors have the same thing. There's sometimes people don't like to hear what you say, right? And at the end of the day, you have a voice. You have a voice for a lot of people. And a lot of the folks that may be in your parishioners our law enforcement. It's time to stand on your values. And I don't know what happened in this country where our values and our ethics become quiet. They shouldn't become quiet, especially for pastors. You need to speak up. You need to say what you think. This is the time to be loud, not just be silent professionals anymore.
Amen. That's the reason we're having you on.
Well, I appreciate it.
But you know, this is the reason that we started a 501c4, is because I believe that constitutionally I have the right to speak out on political issues, anything, and I believe that that is absolutely correct. But that is not the prevalent way of looking at it, and so just as an added layer of protection, we started a 501c4 that can be political. But a lot of people are absolutely afraid. And I think I told you before this broadcast, but I've lost like a dozen black supporters, partners that have been partners with me for years. And this week they've sent, and because I didn't come out and promote Black Lives Matter and stuff, they said that I'm a white supremacist and they are against me and they're doing things. And so there is this political correctness, this fear that if I don't fall in line with everything that's going on, that people are going to leave my church. They're going to quit contributing. And so it's really intimidation. Somehow or another it's turned around that the intimidation factor is a deal.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons people are quiet. But praise God, we need to serve the Lord and not people.
Yeah.
Fear of man brings a snare. Well, we're about out of time here, but Jason, I want to thank you for doing this, and I just want to say that we really do support what you're doing, and thank you so much for the way you've been nice to Karis and Andrew Wommack Ministries. It's been awesome. You've been a real partner with us.
Thank you so much.
Great.
I really appreciate being here today.
Is there anything else you want to say, your last shot before we go?
Last thing is just know that your officers and deputies, they love you and love them, because I think that we're all blessing upon each other. And the one thing I've seen in life is that the more we respect each other and we help each other, there shouldn't be these issues. So just stand for law enforcement and protect us as much as we've protected you in the past.
I tell you what, let's everybody just pray, not only for Jason, but let's use him as just a representative and pray for law enforcement, because man, this is a bad time, and it's one of those situations where you aren't going to win whichever side you take. Somebody's going to be up against you. So Father, we just lift up all of our law enforcement, and we thank you for these people that have chosen to take a career where their life is at risk, their family is at risk, and they're laying it all on the line. Father, I just thank you for every one of them. I ask that you speak to them, that you encourage them. When people are rejecting them and they're feeling all of this anger towards them, Father, I pray that you just supernaturally let them know that they are doing a good job, that you're with them. Father, for people who have a wrong attitude and are in it for the wrong reason, we pray that you'd weed those people out, that Father, this would change them. But we pray for our law enforcement according to Romans 13. They are ministers of God to us for good. And Father, we just pray that they fulfill that. We thank you for it, and we pray, as Jason was saying, that you help all of us to stand up and not be silent, but to stand against this evil that is characterizing all law enforcement as bad. Father, I thank you that you are raising people up to be a voice, and we just thank you. We believe we're getting through this thing and we're coming out better than before. Amen. In the name of Jesus.
Amen.
Amen. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Amen.
Thank you for joining us, and this will be archived on our site if you would like to share it with somebody else. But continue to pray for all of the law enforcement and all of our politicians, that people will have a backbone and stand up. This is absolutely crazy that people would want to get rid of law enforcement. So pray that they have wisdom and that they stand up against this evil. So thank you for being with us. God bless you. We'll see you next Monday night for our Truth and Liberty broadcast.
Join us next time for the Truth and Liberty broadcast. Find tonight's episode and related articles and links at truthandliberty.net. Truth and Liberty is viewer supported. If you'd like to help us continue our live casts, you can make a donation at truthandliberty.net.